Okay, so we're live streaming now.
Good afternoon or good day to everyone. Welcome to the ESMARConf2023. This is the panel discussion on stakeholder engagement and evidence synthesis. If you have any questions for our presenters, you can ask them via the ESMARCon Twitter account by commenting on the tweet about this session. If you register the conference, you can also comment on and chat with other participants on our dedicated Slack channel. And we'll try and answer those questions as soon as possible, and if not live, maybe just after the event. We'd like you to take some time to have a look at our code of conduct, which is available on the ESMARConf website at www.esmarconf.org. So let's get this panel started. I'll pass you over to our presenter, Alex.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Matt. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to what's, I think, just going to be an hour of chatting about stakeholder engagement in reviews, which is a great opportunity. So the sort of aim of the next hour is for us to discuss and explore how stakeholders have been involved in systematic reviews. As panel members, we're not actually familiar with each other's reviews, so I think we're all hoping that we'll learn things from each other as we go along. So we're going to try and keep this as informal as we can in terms of discussion, but we have got a set of questions that we'll work through so that we really work through the sort of process of how we all thought about involving stakeholders in our reviews. So I'm going to start with my first question, which is, who are you and why are you here? So I'll go to Armin with that.
Thanks, Alex. Well, I have to admit I'm not a evidence synthesis guy. I am working for a science, technology and society unit at the Graz University of Technology here in Austria. I have a long history and quite some track records in stakeholder engagement in controversial technology topics, but not in evidence synthesis. Still, a couple of years ago, in the course of a European Union-funded project, we started to explore the use of evidence synthesis in the field of GMO, as genetically modified organisms, impact studies. And in that project, which quite a huge task, we were responsible for the stakeholder engagement and developed a kind of specific approach.
Brilliant, really interesting area. Thank you, Steve.
Hey, good to see everybody. My name is Stephen Cooke. I'm a professor at Carleton University, which is based in Ottawa, Canada, which also happens to be on the lands of the traditional lands, which are also unceded, of the Algonquin peoples. I lead the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Based Conservation and happen to be the secretary for the Collaboration for Environmental Evidence. I'm an applied fish ecologist by training, although working in the environmental evidence space, our team tackles projects that extend beyond that. So I'm a subject matter expert as it relates to fishy things, and certainly involved in evidence synthesis. But I think that's one of the things I really like about this is a member of an evidence synthesis team, one gets to work on projects where there's tons of opportunity for learning. And a lot of that learning comes from those interactions with stakeholders and rights holders. And I look forward to talking about that today.
Great, thank you. Emma.
Hi, everybody. I'm Emma France. I'm based at the University of Stirling in Scotland, UK. I'm part of a research unit there called the ESMARC Research Unit. And I'm an associate professor with interests in children and families' health, particularly around long-term health conditions. And I recently led a project which was what we call a qualitative evidence synthesis, so pulling together multiple qualitative studies to try and get a handle on what the studies were saying and to come up with novel findings based on those studies. And it was around children's chronic pain, and we had extensive stakeholder involvement in that, including children and young people, parents of children with chronic pain, and a wider group involving healthcare professionals, the third sector, like charities, and others, like academics with an interest in the topic. So that's why I'm here today.
Brilliant, thank you. So they're coming back round to me. So we've got very varied four of us. It's great. So my background is largely in Cochrane reviews, and I've been coordinating editor of Cochrane Stroke for the last few years. Very heavily involved in doing stroke reviews and have involved stakeholders within my stroke reviews. So the next question on our list then, we're very briefly going to touch, I think, on definitions. So I think we have to acknowledge there's international variation in how different terms are used when it comes to stakeholder engagement. Today is not the forum for us to spend. I think we could spend the rest of the hour talking about what term we should use. But I thought it would be useful if we all just started by saying what the term stakeholder engagement means to you, just so that we know what we're all talking about. So if I come back to you, Armin.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, the term stakeholder, what it includes and what it doesn't include has been an issue also in our activities. And we have a tendency to keep it as broad as possible. But on the other hand, then it could include everyone who has a kind of interest. Could be a teacher, for example. So so in practice, therefore, so it's typically then narrowed down to organized groups. And in our activities, I think we typically involve key stakeholder groups. For in this case, with GMO impacts, it was typically the biotech industry, seed industry, civil society organizations, competent authorities, these type of actors.
Thank you, Steve. You anything to add there?
Yeah, and Armin just used the word actors, which is a word that in Canada we're tending to lean towards a lot more, because the word stakeholders excludes our right holders, or it diminishes their value. Admittedly, the case study I'm talking about today does not involve rights holders, so I'm not going to go down that path, but I'll try and keep my Canadian hat on and insert that perspective whenever relevant. A lot of the work that we do is about informing environmental decisions. And so the key actor group that we're usually interacting with are environmental decision makers at a variety of levels, from those on the ground frontline practitioners who, you know, in my case, are wearing rubber boots and are in the field, you know, getting dirty, through to those that are based at headquarters of various organizations, making high-level policy decisions that guide the frontline practitioners. And part of that ecosystem, that environmental decision-making ecosystem, does include other groups like industry representatives or the NGO sector where appropriate. But I think it's all about context, right? The stakeholder group for one systematic review, one topic, one issue is going to vary quite widely.
Absolutely, yes. Emma?
I think it can be quite hard actually to know what you're talking about sometimes when you're saying you've involved people, or what involvement is versus engagement. There seems to be a lot of definitions out there. In the UK, I think we might have quite specific terminology that might not be used by the signs of it in Canada or where Armin's based either. So we took the view that involvement was more about collaboration and having people involved in decision making, whereas engagement might be more telling people what you were doing rather than really getting them involved in the day-to-day process of doing an evidence synthesis or a systematic review. And we separated out what we called our patient and public involvement, our children, young people and parents or carers, and had a specific group for them, versus our wider, what we had called stakeholders, so like our clinicians, healthcare professionals, and charities and so forth.
Yeah, so I think my experience is probably quite similar to Emma's. So I've come from that field of patient and public involvement, which is also sometimes PPI that people talk about. So this is very much about having people with lived experience of a health condition contributing in some way to the systematic review. But like Armin and Steve have also said, we do then acknowledge that broader group of stakeholders, which would, in my case, would be then health professionals, so clinicians working in the field, and then policymakers, organisations supporting patients and carers, etc. So I think, although we might use different terms, I think we've probably all got similar models. Picking up on Emma's point about the term involvement and engagement, I think what I have very much come to realise that in the UK, as Emma said, we use the word involvement, which I think if you're in Canada, you would use the word engagement, and they really mean the same thing. But when we use engagement in the UK, it's got quite a different term. So it just, adds a layer of complexity. But I think, so in today's conversation, we might interchange between involvement and engagement, but I think it's fair to say we're probably all talking about the same thing. So if we move on then in terms of sort of thinking of the reviews that we've done and what we actually did in terms of stakeholder involvement, I think we've all given some thought and selected one of the evidence syntheses that we've done in the past where we've involved stakeholders. And we're sort of going to take it in turns to talk through the different aspects of how we went about that involvement. Now, many of the questions that we've sort of going to work through have come from the active framework, which is a framework which I've been involved in developing, which is a very simple framework, just based around how to describe that stakeholder involvement. And I think that Matt's going to share the link to that within the chat that he's got. So we'll just go back round again, I think, and if we each say what the evidence synthesis is that we're going to focus on today, and really why we decided to have stakeholder involvement in that evidence synthesis. Armin, are you all right if I come to you first again?
Yeah, sure. I think we have made a very particular case. So because evidence synthesis was for the first time systematically explored in the area of socioeconomic, environmental, and health impact. So 3 totally different domains of research and evidence. And in that, it was a large endeavor, essentially, where we started off developing 68 review questions. And in that, this area has, well, the particular issue about this area is that this is heavily contested. It's extremely controversial. It's heavily polarized. And there is typically a lack of trust between the various actors. So therefore, in our case, it was not a single evidence synthesis. So, and I think my turn on this was not to develop a stakeholder engagement or to use a stakeholder engagement for a single systematic review, rather than developing something that would possibly work for this kind of polarized and controversial issue, which is characterized by the lack of trust. I think that was our role.
Interesting, thank you. Steve.
So the example I'm going to use is based on a paper by Jessica Taylor, published in 2019 in the journal Environmental Evidence, and I was one of the co-authors, and it was all about the effectiveness of different habitat creation or enhancement methods for substrate spawning fish. So think salmon. So if we're going to build a rock pile, do fish use it or not for spawning? I think important to know is that we were contracted by Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the federal agency in Canada responsible for fish habitat management and protection. And so, not surprisingly, a big element of that was being relevant to them. But at the same time, there's always this tension about independence, right? So, we want to be relevant and engage relevant parties, but we also don't want that level of engagement to be such that it actually biases what we do. And so that was something that we had really spent a lot of time thinking about. And as we go a little bit further today, what you're going to learn is we actually took advantage of a parallel process embedded within Fisheries and Oceans Canada to do that, to help create a pathway for engagement and also to validate what we did through their routine processes. It's basically a process by which Fisheries and Oceans Canada brings new science, new evidence into their day-to-day management processes. So instead of there being this third-party systematic review that just sort of floated out here, we took advantage of that process. And I'll tell you a bit more about that shortly.
Thank you. Yeah, Emma.
Thanks. That was really interesting to hear Armin and Steve's points around the influence that involvement might have in your review, and how, you know, you have to be careful, I think, to get that balance of different views, and whether it might introduce some bias that's in some way undesirable, which I think isn't something has been talked about a lot, but is definitely important, because everybody comes with their own kind of background experience, and they might have another agenda, if you wanted to call it that. The review that I was going to really focus on today was a project which we're still disseminating, but we've kind of formally finished, around children's chronic pain, which I mentioned earlier. We called it the Champion Project for short, because it has a really long title. It's a meta-ethnography, which is a type of qualitative evidence synthesis, if people are interested in that. But we wanted to involve people right from the start. So even when we were putting in for funding, we had children, young people with chronic pain, parents and carers, and others involved in commenting on our plans for the project, and the questions and objectives that we had, in order to make sure that it was relevant to the people that were going to be affected. So, you know, children's health services, health and social care services for chronic pain, and it went right through the whole process. So more or less pretty much every stage of the evidence synthesis had involvement from children, young people, and their parents. And, you know, they're still involved now while we're disseminating, which is, you know, it can be hard to keep people going. But we started in 2020 with the actual project, and we've managed to keep our group with us right up until now, 2.5 or so years later.
Yeah, thank you. So my one that I've chosen to talk about is maybe a little bit different, in that it's a Cochrane review. So obviously the aim with the Cochrane review is that it gets updated every few years. So I've chosen to talk about a review which is to do with physical rehabilitation after stroke. And this is a review that was first published in 1999, 2000, with no formal stakeholder involvement. And then when I did an update of it, so I think this was the second or the third update in sort of 2012-ish, I felt, as did others, that this review was maybe not hitting the mark in terms of influencing clinical practice and policy. It was just slightly off. It was sitting on the shelf unread, perhaps, which was maybe to do with the language that was being used within it, within the way that the physiotherapy was being described. So in that update, we really wanted to engage and involve stroke survivors and carers and physiotherapists, really to try and address that issue and make sure that the Cochrane review was turned around and was really properly useful and meaningful to the end user. So I'll just move on as I'm talking about mine and talk about the next question, which was about who was involved and how did you recruit them. So I think I've just said in my example, stroke survivors, carers and physiotherapists. That was a very obvious selection for this review, which was about the clinical delivery of physiotherapy. So quite a complex question. Within the UK, guidance says that a stroke survivor gets 45 minutes a day of physiotherapy. But our question was really about what is the content of that physiotherapy? What is the physiotherapist doing in that 45 minutes, which could be a whole lot of different stuff. So in terms of recruiting people, we decided we wanted to have a group of sort of 12 to 16-ish, so that we could manage having face-to-face meetings, very much pre-COVID times. We were going to meet in a room. And we wanted to have a group that was 50% stroke survivors and carers and 50% people with clinical experience. And in terms of recruiting those, we wrote a single-page role description of what the role would be in that group, that stakeholder group. with lots of details in it. So we actually specifically stated in that one-page description the dates of all the meetings that we were going to have across the whole 18 months of the project. So we were very upfront in terms of what we were asking people to do. We circulated that role description using existing networks that we had, so that went out via stroke charities and stroke patient support organisations and physiotherapy networks. Asked people who were interested to get back to us and give us a little bit of information about themselves. And then we did a sort of purposeful sampling in terms of to try and pull together a representative group of the 14 that we ended up. In terms of getting that representation, we were looking for people that had different lengths of time post-stroke, different types of stroke-related disability, or for the physiotherapists, different settings that they worked in, so make sure we had representation of acute hospital care and community care, and different years of experience. So we deliberately made sure that we had some newly qualified physios, along with physios who were in very sort of senior positions. So we used that and pulled our group together. I suspect that is very different from how Armin went about his. So I'll hand over to Armin and hear what you did.
Well, thank you, Alex. It's a nice contrast because in comparison to the field that you are has been describing, evidence synthesis has not been used in the field of GMO impacts. So therefore, stakeholders even did not know what evidence synthesis is all about, how this is being conducted elsewhere, and what it means to do a systematic review. So therefore, we decided to give a particular emphasis also on introducing them at the concept and the methods by using examples, and also aimed at the broad involvement. So we used the kind of snowballing approach to start it off with 500 email contacts, and then just try to spread it among really broader stakeholder groups based in entire Europe, mainly European Union, which at that time includes the UK. So it was quite successful, and they were kind of inspired by the novelty of that approach. So in our first, I remember, in our first face-to-face meeting, and it was a multi-step process, we gathered 59 people in the room. So it was really, I mean, it was in a kind of successful, but also difficult to handle these large groups. But it also helped, I think, to introduce also the concept. A tricky thing was in this kind of polarized environment to get people understand what role evidence synthesis could play in a field where every bit of evidence is being heavily contested. But perhaps we can talk about that later.
Yeah, I think, as you say, really nice contrast between yours and mine. So yours sounds like it was very much an open recruitment and anyone who was interested should come along. Whereas my example, we had sort of pre-planned, we were going to have quite a small group and try and get a representative group. So yeah, nice contrast of the two methods. Steve, what did you do?
Yeah, I think it's probably worth noting that for the example I'm providing, it was really on the back end where there was a massive amount of engagement. And that's, again, because we had this process. So this all came about because there were revisions to the Fisheries Act. And this is the act that governs everything that's done on the landscape. So if somebody is going to put in a road, if somebody's going to build a house, water rolls off the landscape and could affect fish. So it's a very powerful piece of legislation. And so there's a lot of interest among that broader community, from developers, oil and gas, transportation sector, the environmental consultants, and then, of course, the regulators that had come up with this legislation. So we were doing science to support the rollout of that new legislation. And I'd alluded before to this internal government process. And in Fisheries and Oceans Canada, it's called CSAS, the Canadian Science Advisory Secretariat. And that's a process by which they take knowledge and evidence that comes from all sorts of different sources and use that to sort of bring it into that management sphere. And so most of the decisions that would be made by managers, practitioners on a day-to-day basis would be derived from what are called science advisory reports, or SARs, that come out of these CSASs. So it was fine and dandy that we had a completed systematic review. That would have been ignored. Okay, so what we needed to do was to essentially go through that internal validation process to essentially establish institutional legitimacy for what we had done. And that involved 70 plus stakeholders. We met in Ottawa, again, pre-COVID. And Canada's a big country. We needed representatives from all our provinces and territories, because the geography and cultural context and fish communities are so varied across the country. We had representatives from a number of those aforementioned industry sectors. And then within DFO, we had their science team, we had practitioners, and we had some external academics. And essentially, it was like an additional layer of peer review, but from a very practical perspective. And at the end of the day, we ended up with a bulleted list of take-home messages. And that's what went to DFO practitioners across the country. That was message from them. The systematic review wasn't slapped down on their desk. Instead, it was this additional document. So in some ways, when I'm talking about stakeholder engagement here, I'm almost sort of drifting into the knowledge mobilization and translation space. But for this one, I think it's unique, which is why I chose this one. That's where that process happened. Haven't done that for others, but I think, again, it goes back to who was the contractor and the fact that we really needed to embed what we did within DFO processes. And without that, we wouldn't have had legitimacy. It would have been just an academic exercise.
So it sounds like your stakeholder group was almost predetermined. You know, they were sitting there and ready to go. So it's another nice, different example from Armin went out and formed his by recruiting them. I recruited a small group, but you actually had those people sitting, waiting to be involved in many ways. Yeah. What about your example, Emma?
Mine's probably more similar to yours, Alex, because I'm working in, the health field. I mean, we had to take different approaches to recruitment, and we had like a core group of children and young people with chronic pain and their parents or guardians. But we also went wider than that when we needed to, and did ad hoc kind of recruitment and involvement. So we had our initial patient and public involvement at the very start, which I referred to earlier. And then when the project started, we looked to try and recruit children and young people who had different sex or gender from age. We thought age 8 would probably be the youngest that could really contribute in the kind of way we were looking for. So we wanted to involve them in decisions in the project and analysis. So for our children, young people, we were looking for them from age 8 up to 18. And we ended up going slightly wider than that, because we had some young people who are maybe 19, 20, but who, were very recently using children's services. And we wanted to get a range of different health conditions that cause chronic pain, so that we had a good spread of experiences, people in different parts of the United Kingdom. We're focused pretty much on the UK for this, because our funder is interested in the relevance for the UK's National Health Service. We wanted to get mums and dads, or guardians who were not necessarily biological parents, but it's challenging. I don't know how others have found it. Sometimes trying to get that spread that you want and diversity you want is difficult. So we didn't recruit dads. We had one person who identified as a boy, the rest were girls with chronic pain. We didn't get a great range of people from different ethnic backgrounds. Most were Caucasian or white, as you might call it. But we did get diversity in other aspects, so different kinds of chronic pain conditions, living in different circumstances, different parts of the UK. And we had our core group of 12 children, young people, and 8 mums that came with us. And then when we needed to get a wider view, then we did things like social media engagement, surveys, online surveys, to try and to get wider kind of views from a more diverse or a broader group.
Oh, that's interesting. So you actually had your group, but then you were going out to other organisations and things to then get sort of add on to the involvement you had. Yeah,
it's not quite as broad as Steve and Armin's approaches, which is really interesting to hear about.
I wonder if we just stick with you, Emma, going to the next question, as you've just described your group. So I think you're beginning to touch on that. So the next question was about, what was the mode of involvement or engagement? So what did you actually do? I think you said to us, you've got this group of children and mums. So how did they make decisions for your review?
Yeah, well, we knew in advance that we wanted to get them involved in decisions around, for example, which kind of studies we included. And to help us refine what we call our search strategy, where should we be looking for studies and evidence? Are there any experts we need to be contacting to see if they know of studies in this area? So we wanted input in the kind of early stages of the design of what we were doing. But we also wanted to get them involved in analysis, which hadn't been done before for a meta-ethnography, as far as I know, and is quite challenging because it's quite technical, and so we came up with some creative ways of getting them involved in analysis. We used cartoons to convey findings, and we were going to have face-to-face meetings. We had funds from our funder, the National Institute of Health Research, to hold face-to-face meetings. COVID happened, we couldn't have any face-to-face meetings. So we had to do it online, which is quite different from what we had planned, and come up with creative ways of involving people in something quite dynamic. Using video conferencing, and so we would send people materials in advance. We developed little cartoons to express some of the early findings, either directly from studies that we weren't really sure about what they meant, or early findings that from our analysis, to find out what did it resonate with them, could they disconfirm any of the findings, to clarify what things meant. There were some terms used in the literature that weren't very well explained. Like, they talked a lot about having control over chronic pain in the studies, but they didn't really explain what they meant by that. And so we had discussions and input from our group about what control meant to them, which actually was quite varied, and seemed to differ whether you're a parent or a young person. And the idea of being able to control your chronic pain was seen quite negatively, actually. And so it really informed how we were thinking about the analysis. And then they were involved through, the further stages around how should we be disseminating what's going to appeal to children and young people. And we're currently working on an animation, like animated cartoon, to convey the findings in a format that will appeal to children and young people. So we've got our children and young people deciding that the style of animation that appeals to them, looking at they helped us work out which findings we should be trying to convey in a short animation. If it's 3 minutes, you can't convey everything. What's most important, what's most helpful, most interesting to people of your age, and commenting on the little script, the little story that we put together to accompany the animation, to ensure that it's understandable, that it's appealing, it's engaging, and it's not going to make children, young people feel bad for having chronic pain. So
yeah, so there's a question that's come in from YouTube, but I think actually you've done quite a good job of addressing it. The question is, what if some of the stakeholders don't have the technical skills needed to fully engage in the process? I think, what you're saying is that you took it down to their level. You've got to take it down to the level of an 8-year-old and make it under. So it sounds like you had a lot of discussion about terms and actually just chat about taking it back to basics.
Absolutely, and we had to get rid of all our academic jargon and find language that was meaningful to children, young people, parents, and the feedback they gave us were that we were successful in doing that, and that they could understand what we were trying to achieve in what's actually quite a dry, academic piece of work in some respects, and brought it to life.
Yeah, so if I move on and talk about what we did, I think just because there's some parallels between your experience and mine, Emma, and then we'll move to Armin and Steve. And I think addressing that question as well, when we formed our group of stroke survivors, carers and physiotherapists, we specifically said that they did not need to have any technical skills, that we were interested in their lived experience of rehabilitation following stroke or delivering rehabilitation to stroke survivors. We didn't expect people to know what an evidence synthesis was or what an RCT was, and that we would tell them that. So we pre-planned right from the beginning, so before we'd even recruited the group, that we would have 3 meetings. And each of those meetings had a very pre-planned aim that we wanted to achieve. So the first 2 meetings happened right at the beginning of the review update when we were sort of tweaking with the protocol. So the first one was about working out what the scope of the review was and whether it was right or whether it needed to be changed, plus how we would describe and categorize the physiotherapy interventions. So that meeting, we started by very, very simple, what is a trial? People get randomized to one group or another. We used the example of if you wanted to find out whether eating chocolate made you feel better, and just tried to make it meaningful to the people. And then we went on and talked about bringing trials together into a systematic review. That worked. These were not people that had, at the end of this, an in-depth understanding of a systematic review, but they knew enough to understand why having a way of describing physiotherapy was relevant to the bit of research that we were doing. So, and they were in a format where they could ask questions. So I think if you'd spoken to any of the stroke survivors or carers afterwards, they probably wouldn't be able to give you a very good definition of a systematic review, but they absolutely knew why it was important that we had a way of describing what physiotherapy was and what happened in that 45 minutes of physio. Was it a physiotherapist using a bit of machinery, or was it the physiotherapist talking to them and coaching them, or was it them doing fitness training, or was it them somehow having some hands-on treatment? So the patients involved understood that part of it. As I said, we had pre-planned aims for each of our meetings, and a goal, a decision that we were handing over to our stakeholder group. So in order to make that decision, we used relatively formal consensus decision-making techniques, so based on the nominal group technique, where we got the group to discuss around the issue. So what should the scope be, agree a statement, and then do a series of voting. So we really had objective data at the end to demonstrate that we had reached consensus on the way we were going to move forward. So I'll hand over to Armin now, I think, to get a very different view on what you actually did in practice with your group of 59 people.
Yeah, probably yes. I think in our case, well, initially we set out to do stakeholder involvement across key steps of developing protocols and conducting systematic reviews or maps, and with a number of these activities doing in parallel. But given the novelty of the issue to us as a team, the many tasks in parallel, and also the fact that this was a very controversial issue, we did not get to that really to finalizing the systematic reviews in the course of the project. We saw our stakeholder engagement focused on developing the review protocols. Yeah, so explaining the method, familiarizing stakeholders with what is evidence synthesis is all about and how it can be possibly used. Then developing questions. I mean, it was a huge task to make stakeholders also understand what type of questions you can ask for a systematic review and what you cannot, and how broad and how narrow. Yeah. So it took a time, and also as with GMO impact assessments at all, every single question is being contested. That means also the question actually in what particular impacts we would look at, and what would be neglected, for example. So in that context, so our main focus was to develop a kind of long candidate list of review questions, then discuss these review questions, refine it, prioritize them, narrow it down, and then based on that, write and publish a review protocols. So that was a multi-step process, essentially 3 main steps: developing the questions, the candidate list, then prioritizing them, and compose the review protocols, 3 main steps. And we used face-to-face meetings, we used email consultations, written questions, written answers, and also we used online surveys, in particular for prioritizing the review questions. As I mentioned, we started off with 69 review questions and narrowed them down to a total of 14. And still at that time did some refurbishing, reframing, rephrasing of the questions. So it was and the particular well, quite extensive task turned out to be the email consultations, because in the entire process, just developing the questions and the protocols, we received and responded to in writing a total of 520 questions. So we have with several volumes of reports, which included the questions and the written responses of the team members. So it was quite a task.
Yeah, I've seen lots of parallels between priority setting processes. So in the UK, we have the James Lind Alliance priority setting process, which is about generating questions for research more broadly. But I really like that idea of doing it, knowing that you're going to do the evidence synthesis at the end. So yeah, really nice example. So then Steve, your example is different because you're at the other end of the review process, I think, aren't you? So
absolutely. Yeah, and I told you that I was going to base this off of 1 review. We actually ended up having to do 2, which was unplanned. So we had our sort of gold standard systematic review, and we really focused on the so-called high quality evidence. And before we met with our stakeholder group, they said, whoa, where's the rest of it? You're telling us this is the extent of the evidence base. And we said, well, no, there's a whole lot more, but it's biased in all sorts of ways. And they said, well, we want to see it. And so we ended up doing a parallel synthesis focused on the low quality evidence. And then we brought all of that to the room with the associated caveats that comes with that. And that was a really fascinating process because it allowed the practitioners and folks that live in this fish habitat world on a day-to-day basis to learn about the difference between something that is high quality and something that is low quality, where bias comes from. And from a really practical perspective, it allowed them to also see what they could do to help build that evidence base moving forward. So if the folks in the room as regulators, they have to authorize habitat alterations. And usually there's some monitoring along with that. The monitoring was pretty pathetic, frankly. And so simply by having better standards for monitoring, you actually can build that evidence base and then strengthen, have more support for those, decisions in the future. So we learned a lot from that process about what stakeholders think of different forms of knowledge, different studies. So there was learning for us, there was learning for them. And at the end of the day, it allowed us to also have that literally side-by-side comparison. Here's the conclusion from the so-called gold standard with high quality evidence. Here's the rest. And here's what you get, and you do get different answers. And so, what are the biases and limitations with that? So yeah, it was quite illuminating, and it allowed us to make sure that when we were generating that science advisory report, that internal document for DFO, that as appropriate we could pull some things from that lower quality evidence base, but doing so with eyes wide open in a very transparent way. So it's really about the interpretation and implementation side, where those things sort of came together. So yeah, it's definitely on the back end of the process. Armin's example, I'm impressed about being able to go from more questions down to fewer. Every process I've been involved with, when you bring stakeholders into the room early on, it explodes and there's mission creep in all directions. So well done.
So I think, given time, we should skip forward to the question that we had, which was about how much control did the stakeholders have? And there's been another question come in from YouTube, and that really is the same question. So it says, how do we avoid forcing stakeholders who lack the technical skills to just nod, agree to whatever we tell or show them? How do we make them more critical about whatever we tell them? In other words, how do we avoid authority bias? So I wonder, Steve, it might make sense just to stick with you to start with on that, as we've just been hearing about your project. So at that final stage then, did you feel that your stakeholders had real meaningful control over the decisions that came out?
Yeah, absolutely. And although I would also suggest that they all had technical skills, they all were active in that fish habitat space. So everybody in that room had some level of professional environmental training. So I think that's a bit different. But they all had as the regulator, they wanted to make sure the science supporting the regulation made sense. If you're the industry player and you work for a hydropower company, and at the end of the day, you have to spend millions more, you have a pretty big stake in it. So there was a high level of engagement because this was part of a policy process, rolling out a new piece of legislation. So again, that made it very clear who the most obvious stakeholders were. And if they weren't in the room, we would have ended up with something that, again, lacked legitimacy, not only within DFO, but also externally. So that was the importance there. But again, I think a different one. So I'm keen to hear from others that might deal with, for example, some of the children that Emma deal with, which have certainly had experience, but probably no formal training in medicine, for example.
Yeah, well, let's go to Emma then. So Emma, did you think that the children and parents involved, what level of control did they have over the decisions that were made in that review that you carried out?
I think it varied depending on which part of the review we were working on. We didn't have a co-applicant or co-investigator on the study who was representative of patients or the public. And if we had, then the level of control over the initial steps would have probably been greater. And so that's something I would probably do different next time. There were certain things we had to do because that's the kind of accepted process you use for doing an evidence synthesis. And so we tried to make it clear what decisions they could influence and make, and which ones were not up for discussion and couldn't really be changed and explained why. So I don't know, I think it's a really interesting question about avoiding authority bias. I don't know if maybe you don't always know if you've had authority bias, and so it is hard to avoid, isn't it? But having ground rules as well during meetings and being quite open and honest about whether we as a team had a preferred option was important and makes it more transparent. And then when we're reporting what we've done, also to say, well, we went to our group and we said, this is what we were thinking would be a good thing to do. Did they agree or disagree? So if we had like a preference, we tried to be just very transparent about that. And where we didn't have a preference at all, again, we were quite open and transparent about it. And just the way we interacted with people, we tried to make sure everyone felt comfortable and that they were listened to and that we took on board their comments. And that if we couldn't act on a decision, we told them why, but we always fed back what we had done as a result of their participation in meetings and to try and make sure that we had a trail, basically, a trail of how we decided things and what level of input our young people and parents had. Yes,
I think my experience is quite similar to yours, although we maybe formalized some of that sort of control. So we had, as I said, I've already said, we pre-decided which decisions we were handing over to our stakeholder group. So there were some clear decisions about the scope of the review. I'm not going to go into the technical details, but whether we expanded into some of the international approaches to physical rehabilitation or whether we focused it down more specifically. There were clear decisions about what subgroup analyses were relevant, so what questions did people have about the sort of subgroups that were relative to this. So we pre-decided that, and we absolutely handed the decisions over to the stakeholders. So that process of nominal group technique that I've mentioned, so that the group had a discussion, discussed around a number of things, came up with a statement. The researchers and the reviewers were involved in the discussion, but didn't get a vote. So the decision was carried or not on the views of the stroke survivors, carers, and physios. So ours was very much definitely in those decisions were in control. But like Emma, there were other parts of the review process where our stakeholder group had no involvement. We were carrying out Cochrane methods, and they weren't involved in our development of our screening process or assessment of risk of bias. That was very much done without stakeholder involvement. So we had those separate decisions. I have to say, as a researcher, it was absolutely terrifying. We had decided we were handing over decisions to them, and I can remember that moment of panic when my heart increased as I realised they were going to make a decision that was not what I would have made as a researcher. So I can absolutely say our group had control over some elements, but not all elements. So then over to you then, Armin, with yours. I'm sure you had a very vocal group.
Oh yes, we had. I mean, I was smiling when I read the comment about how do you avoid authority bias. So because we had quite the opposite problem. In our case, I mean, similar to what Steve was describing. So the stakes were quite high for everyone. At that time, there was a rumor that evidence synthesis might become part of the routine pre-market assessment of genetically modified organisms in one way or another. So therefore, there was a lot of interest for all stakeholders to understand what it could possibly mean in practice. It also partly explains where there was quite a number of participants involving, but also explains then a strong interest to interact and perhaps even influence what is being discussed and what is being decided. So in that context, we for us it was quite clear that the core team has to stay in control of the entire process. It was fairly too new for our stakeholders and also for some of our team members to make a kind of voting on all decision-making steps. So the only voting process that we had is when narrowing down the review questions from 69 to 14. So that was the real voting. In all other questions, we had kind of discussions and trying to balance it. But the tricky thing for us was that these kind of divided world into two camps, pro or con, GM crops or GM organisms, also stretched out into the academic world and into the review teams. So you cannot even avoid that. Yeah? So therefore, you have to deal with that. And the way we decided to deal is to force all our team members to really consider every single comment made by a stakeholder, carefully consider it and respond to it in writing. So that you clearly argue if you will consider it, and if not, why we will not consider it. So these kind of mechanisms helped us to make sure that we keep a kind of balance. But that was really a tightrope walk, I have to admit.
Yeah, it sounds it. So I'm aware we've just got 5 minutes left. So I wonder if we just do sort of another round and each of us reflect on the impact really of having the stakeholder involvement. So what did it change, and was it worth it? So Armin, why don't we stick with you? I think you started to touch on some of that in your last reply.
Well, I think there was a mutual learning process on two different levels. One is that we all learned a lot about evidence synthesis and what it could potentially mean for this field. So I cannot see that it really led to a kind of explosions of evidence synthesis activities in that field, but from them I see every now and then I see kind of reviews, systematic reviews and evidence maps emerging in that field and being used. Far from being routine, but still it's starting. That was one. The other issue was it's a learning about stakeholder interactions and about trust building. So I probably didn't mention that, but it was a 3-year process. Just for essentially developing the review questions, prioritizing them, and developing the protocols and starting the reviews. Not further than that. This alone took 3 years. So and we had several interactions, and it took that many interactions to get to know each other and to kind of make sure that there is a kind of mutual understanding and trust. And even if stakeholders would have very, very different views, that there will be this element of respect, and they will be prepared to listen to each other and to interact with each other in another way than just repeating already general views of their organizations they're representing. That took really a long time, but after 3 years we had to conclude it was worthwhile because over time it really worked out.
Yeah, so I think in a nutshell, it's a huge amount of work, but worth it. So Steve, I think we sort of know that you probably say that yours was worth it, but I mean, any final reflections there on the impact?
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to say much more about the impact, but I do want to touch on co-production very, very briefly. And so certainly in the environmental space, we're sort of in the era of co-production, making sure people know what that is and how to do it well. That's usually on the generation of new knowledge. And so when it comes to evidence synthesis, I think it's really about the co-assessment, collaboratively evaluating what the existing evidence is, what it means, and how to interpret it. And so, yeah, I think just as we think about how these terms and different levels of engagement and what we're looking at, I think we need to make sure that we're appropriately trained to engage in those activities. And that, we're not, with evidence synthesis, I don't consider it generating new knowledge. It is that synthesis. And so I think co-assessment really is a good description for, I think, much of what we talked about today. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Emma?
Your initial question was impact, Alex. I know we haven't got much time left.
Well, yeah, and was it all worth it? What did it change, and was it worth it? In 2 words.
Absolutely, and I would do it all again, and I would do it even better next time. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think my conclusion would be the same. Absolutely, it changed. The review was very, very different as a result of the involvement. It did make it more clinically relevant, but yeah, like everyone's saying, there's a huge amount of work and a huge amount to learn about how we do it well, to have this sort of optimal impact from it. So yeah, I look forward. I'm on my next update of my Cochrane review, so doing it again. So trying to put some of that learning into practice. So yeah, it's been a fantastic conversation. I've enjoyed it. I feel like I've learned a lot. So thank you.
Yeah, it's been
Thank
great.
you.
I've learned loads. It's lovely to meet you all, those of you I've not met before.
I think that's for me to say a final few words. Thank you all for your inputs. It's been really, really, I've learned loads too, so it's been really, really good. And yeah, that's it for this session. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. And yeah, thank you again to